she became, really. Her sister, Pam, remembers her. I was going to say reminds, but that's not what I was trying to say. Remembers her as being happy and joyous. You couldn't find a nicer kid. Her older sister, Cheryl, says Michele was this incredible kid, just curious about the world. The petite brunette with most of the time, ponytailed brown hair and brown eyes threw herself into everything she could find. Growing up in one of America's most affluent areas in Greenwich, Connecticut, she read, she played the piano, the guitar, she sang in the chorus, and she performed in theater. By the time Michele had finished high school in 1970, she was a National Honor Society student and a national thespian. Her sister Cheryl smiled and said, "We called her the hippie without the drugs," which is basically me, without the drugs. Now, with the world in front of her, Michele headed to Denison University in Ohio, one of the nation's oldest liberal arts colleges. After studying abroad in England and Austria, she prepared for grad school. But something inside of her kept bothering her. Her sister Pam said she was always searching for the underdog. She was always looking to help someone who needed help. So at this point in her life, Michele decides to volunteer with an agency called Volunteers in Service for America, or VISTA. It was a newly launched organization, a domestic version of the Peace Corps. VISTA focused on volunteers fighting poverty in the nation's poorest communities. Michele was assigned to St. Louis, Missouri. Her parents tried to talk her out of it. Grad school was waiting. A very good job would follow. VISTA was a volunteer organization. It didn't pay anything. And she was heading into an unknown and possibly dangerous environment. But Michele would have none of it. She would not be talked out of it. She had previously worked summer camps with handicapped Cub Scouts, and she decided that she wanted to work with blind and deaf children, especially poor children. She told her parents that VISTA was only for a year and she would apply to grad school while she was away in St. Louis. Bravely, she packed her bags and headed west. She first landed, not from the plane, but where she was living, in the Soulard area, which y'all know I'm from around the St. Louis area. I love Soulard, but it's not a place I would necessarily walk around at night. And this was not in my time, but VISTA provided what seems like a little $200 a month for living expenses, but you have to take in the account of the times here. Michele found used furniture and she refused help from her parents and friends. Her sister Pam remembered hearing Michelle's voice when she called home. She said, quote, she was very proud of what she was doing. She was really making a difference in people's lives. Her sister Cheryl said this was exactly what she wanted to do. And then she described her as the best of us. With her VISTA year almost over, Michele returned home to Connecticut for Christmas. And she was thrilled about her experience here in St. Louis. Pam says, I remember we just sat and talked all day. She was so happy. Her VISTA time was up and she was ready for grad school and everything was in front of her. And then her family's last visit with Michele because Vista called again. Was there any way she could extend her stay in St. Louis for just 3 more months? Just 3 months. Even though they had known she would be there just for a year, they had not found a replacement for her yet, and she was so needed by the children, of course. Michele couldn't say no, especially just the Laura Michelle Dinwiddie murder case, but possibly to many others. Eventually, Williams would admit to Papias that yes, he was there the night that Michelle was killed, but he didn't do it. But the erosion of time prevented investigators from really being able to pursue this. It was quite the problem. Incredibly, Danny Williams was only 14 years old when Michelle was killed. So they started to wonder, could someone this young have done this? Could this case that was more than 20 years old, lacking any witnesses, any DNA evidence, be brought before a jury? With Williams already behind bars for most of his life, well, most of the rest of his life, and Missouri not having a death penalty when Michelle was murdered, it really sort of became a moot point for the police and the family. Danny Williams admitting to being at the scene was about as close as a confession as they were going to get. It was partial closure for the family more than 20 years after Michelle's murder. Cheryl, her sister, said, "The police department never gave up, and we were very grateful." But for her sisters, solving this case was a blessing, but not quite real closure, really. I mean, Cheryl wonders if Danny Williams knew Michelle. Was he one of the young people that she was working to help? They also remained shocked at his age. I mean, he was 14. Had their sister been murdered by an 8th grader? It was very hard to believe that someone so young could have done this, Cheryl said. And Pam, of course, had other questions. She said, "I would like to meet him just one time. I would like to know why he picked my sister. How could he have hurt someone as kind as Michelle? I would like to ask him what his life was like. Violence is impeded in upbringing, so what caused this violent streak? I'm sure he has a story." And Williams does have a story. As I mentioned before, he had quite the rap sheet, quite the lengthy story. Today, as far as I could tell, he is in a Jefferson City prison. He's eligible for parole in 2039 when he turns 78, 64 years after Laura Michelle Dinwiddie was murdered. But, as I said at the beginning of this video, this story doesn't end here. In fact, it's only just getting started. As the years unfolded, Danny Williams would become the prime suspect in numerous other murders. Among them, Gina Dawn Brooks, whose case I will tell you all about next week here on my channel. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope that you don't feel like it's too much of a cliffhanger. I really wanted to cover all of the cases that Danny had been convicted of or things like that, but really I could only find information on 3 of them, and one of them was like not even a page and a half of information. Not nearly enough for me to make a video about it. I mean, here we're at 16 minutes and I just gave you 6 pages of information, so it wouldn't be nearly enough. So probably at the end of the next video I will tell you about that case, and then I will use both of their pictures in the thumbnail. I just didn't want to get too out of order either because it's confusing. So let me tell you what I think about this case. if I were her sister, I would have to know more. Just like they said, was he one of the kids that she was helping? I didn't find anything about him being, like, hearing impaired or anything like that. So, while he could have lived, like, in a poor part of the city and been helped, she was mostly involved with, like, hearing impaired and, you know, signing with kids and things like that. So maybe he had come in contact with her that way, maybe, or something like that, but I could find that a little bit of a stretch. I don't know if he was just seeking a crime of opportunity. He seems to kind of be like the type of man that didn't go for older women just based on his previous rap sheet and the other cases that he has been connected with. So, I don't know. I have to wonder why he would have said that he was there, but he didn't do it when he's already sentenced to life in prison. Maybe it is because he had the possibility of parole and he didn't want to get that taken away. But man, getting out at 78, I mean, what do you really do with your life at that point? I mean, at that point, most people are retired and kind of set with their situation, you know. But I think it's kind of crappy that they didn't pursue any type of charges or anything, simply for her family's sake. I absolutely always feel as though these crimes happen to these people that could have made such a difference in the world. And this girl was like a powerhouse, volunteering all this time to help people who couldn't help themselves, who didn't have the money. There's a really big deaf community in St. Louis, and I know, speaking from my own experience, there is quite the lack of, like, we have the St. Louis School for the Deaf here, but I have looked for ASL classes, I've looked for people teaching it, and I've asked, like, patients and things where I could go to learn sign, and there's just really not a lot of access